Technically, I've always been a writer. However, I haven't always written books and novels. When I first went to college, or when I went to college, I studied management information systems, which is a fancy way of saying computer programming in the business school. And then for the next 2 decades or so, I wrote banking and financial and payment processing related applications and modules for the financial industry. And I was still in that career, and a friend of mine needed help with his business plan, developing a business plan for a new business he was trying to start. And he asked me to work on some spreadsheets and that kind of stuff for him. And I was crunching numbers in a spreadsheet, and I had the television on in the background just to provide white noise while I was working. And Stephen Colbert and the Colbert Report were on, and one of his guests was a guy named Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins is a famous biologist, and he's best known probably as an evangelist for atheism and the author of The God Delusion. So the television's on in the background. It's just providing white noise. And Richard Dawkins says a line that changed my life forever. He said something to the effect that cars and computers and cell phones are all intelligently designed, but the human being is not. And I didn't know enough about physics or chemistry or biology to be able to challenge that statement immediately. Uh, but I knew instinctively it was not a logical statement and it made no sense. Because, for example, the computer is designed and it's designed to emulate human behavior, and the pinnacle of computer programming is called neural networking, which is trying to make a computer act like the human brain. So to say that the computer is intelligently designed, but the human that it's trying to copy is not, is a contradiction, a conundrum. It it makes no sense. But I didn't know that at the time with absolute certainty. I couldn't prove it with evidence. I couldn't argue evidence because I didn't know evidence. So I started reading books, and I read books on biology and chemistry and physics and paleontology and neurology and psychology and you name it. If there's an ology, I probably read a book about it. And while I was reading all these books and reading The God Delusion over and over, I ended up taking about 400 pages of notes. And that in part turned into my first book, which was Divine Evolution. And that was published, I want to say, about 12 years ago. Well, then fast forward 12 years, and my most recent book has been published. And that book is called The God Conclusion, which also coincidentally happens to be the name of this new podcast. The reason the name was chosen was simple. I mean, for the podcast, it's because the book was named The God Conclusion, and it's a branding issue. But The God Conclusion, the book itself, is named that in response to Richard Dawkins and his book. So I hope that, I mean, my ideal target reader and target listener is someone who has listened or read The God Delusion and thought it was a relatively convincing book and might be on the fence, might be wavering, and is open still to other information that might contradict what Dawkins was evangelizing in his book. This podcast is going to be where primarily I'm going to be having conversations with people who have read the book or have visited the Facebook page, also named The God Conclusion, so that they had some criticism of some meme or some article or some other thing that I posted, and their criticisms were such that they were interesting enough that I thought we could have a conversation about our differences of opinion. I think that speaking only to people that agree with you tends to be boring. And I like to explore the differences. And I am coming at this. The God Conclusion was written, even though I myself identify as a Christian, it was not written as a Christian book. It is a book that was written by a Christian, and there is a difference. The God Conclusion does not reference the Bible only if it's necessary to respond to something that Richard Dawkins wrote in his book, because the first 10 chapters of my book correspond to the first 10 chapters, or to the 10 chapters of his book. And I'm basically doing a chapter by chapter rebuttal of what his claims were in The God Delusion. But then the last 5 chapters are an assertive or a positive argument that relies solely and entirely on scientific evidence and logic to make the argument for a supernatural God. In The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins makes clear that there is no room in his world for any type of supernatural deity or any type of supernatural entity for that matter. My contention is there is ample evidence of both a supernatural deity, in other words, a creator God, that can be culled by simple analysis of the scientific evidence and applying logic to it. After writing The God Conclusion and having it published, I started a Facebook page to help promote the book, and it's grown to have approximately 16, 17,000 followers at the moment. But the idea for the podcast came from an interview or a conversation, or basically an extended argument, if you want to know the truth, with this atheist evangelist, anti-theist, and Satanist named, calls himself Aaron Ra. And Aaron came and visited the Facebook page, challenged me to an interview. But then after we recorded it, I couldn't find it online anywhere, and had fortunately made a copy of the interview on my own PC, and that became the first podcast that the channel offers. I don't want to only have adversarial conversations, because those tend to degenerate into arguments. I also want to have conversations where we explore the evidence that supports my argument. So I want to talk to people that do research on the near-death experience. I want to talk to people that have knowledge of interacting with supernatural phenomena like ghosts. I want to talk to people. I want to get more. I want to keep collecting information and providing it in this channel so that we can learn together. So thanks for listening. And I hope you enjoy the podcast.